You are in the gun with Schuyler, Callihan, and Jed Drenning, the signal caller. And today we're going to be breaking down the Big 12 Conference heading into the 2023 season. And there's a lot of new faces, obviously, to be exact, BYU, Cincinnati, Houston, Central Florida. We'll dive into those new programs. We're going to touch a little bit on all the other 13 that West Virginia fans may not be all that familiar with heading into the season. If you want a full deep dive on West Virginia in this upcoming season, Jed, Owen Schmidt, and Wesley Euler, they'll have that for you on our YouTube channel at In the Gun, and you can find that just about anywhere that you get your podcast as well. Go to Believe first and foremost. Check out the threads there. There's all the episodes on the Believe channel. So. But before we get into that real quick, a word from our sponsor, Bet Online. Bet Online is your number one source for all your betting needs. Get the latest odds, lines, and matchup reports for baseball, boxing, golf, and more. Bet Online continues to be the fastest and easiest way to place your wagers, including live betting and your favorite casino and card games available to play right from your phone. Head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today and get in on the action. Remember to use the promo code BELIEVE, that's BLEAV, for your 50% welcome bonus for your first deposit. Bet Online, where the game starts. And Jed, where we start is with the 2021 Big 12 champs, the Baylor Bears. They took a slight step back last year. They went 8-5, quite a disappointing season for a team that was probably by many expected to be in that Big 12 championship race again. They made the decision, Dave Aranda did, to go with Blake Shapen. Back in the spring, they thought it was going to be a quarterback battle between he and Gary Bohannon. Bohannon transfers out. We all know the story. So give us the quick rundown on the Baylor Bears.
Well, let's start with this. Baylor has been really up and down on this roller coaster ride for the better part of the last decade and a half. I mean, no program, I would argue, has enjoyed the extreme highs versus the extreme lows that Baylor has. I mean, even just a microcosm of that would be the Matt Rule tenure. He was only in Baylor in Waco for 3 years. We so often talk about scheduling for success. Baylor understands how to schedule for success. They understand how to put yourself in position from a non-conference standpoint to set yourself up appropriately to get a spring into the season. I'll tell you this. I shared this stat with you, Schuyler. It probably surprised you like it would most. When I mentioned Matt Rule in those 3 years at Baylor, he was successful enough in turning that program around to parlay that into an NFL job, right? With the Carolina Panthers right there where you are. Against ranked teams in his 3 years at Baylor, Matt Rule was 0-11. Well, how do you possibly be regarded as so successful in 3 years when you're 0-11 against ranked teams? Because your non-conference schedule is accommodating enough, you can chalk up some easy wins, beat who you should beat in conference play as you're undergoing that rebuild, and that's the success that he enjoyed. Now, he passed that off to Dave Aranda. Dave Aranda suffered mightily. He took a gamble with a coordinator that didn't work out on the offensive side of the football during the 2020 COVID season. He was quick to make a change. He made the change. He brought in a new coordinator who believes in pounding the football, believes in Jeff Grimes is a guy that is an outside zone guy. He has that RVO offense, that reliable, violent offense, they like to call it. Now, in large measure, that depended on the physicality of his offensive line. The problem that they might suffer, they lose 4 of their starters up front. So Baylor's going to have to undergo a rebuild. Now, I think if anybody is in position to coach their way through a rebuild at the point of attack on the offensive line, it might be Jeff Grimes and his partner in crime, their offensive line coach. They've been together for a long time, is Eric Mateos. So, yes, they're going to be untested. Yes, they're going to lack continuity, but they're going to have to find a way that those guys are going to put them in position to make some things happen on the offensive side of the football. Now, if that does in fact happen, I think they're going to have a puncher's chance because they also lost some playmakers on the defensive side. I mean, you can talk about in the last couple years, not even just last year, but some of the key guys that Baylor has lost with, Siaki is a guy that comes to mind, the big-bodied grizzly bear of a defensive tackle. What athleticism he showed. That's not easy to fill, a loss like that. Dylan Doyle, to me, was the heart and soul of that defense, right in the middle at that Mike Backer spot. So they're going to have to replace some key guys. But again, can Dave Aranda and his defensive pedigree with his sim pressure packages, trying to outfox offenses and get them to waste resources in one direction and bring pressure from the other, can he be the difference maker? Can he compensate for those losses and just simply find a way through solid coaching to overcome that? So you have an offensive line where that needs to happen, and you have a defensive unit where that needs to happen. But that also, Pick Six Previews did a good job of talking about this. That just happens to be the two strengths of this Baylor coaching staff. So that's kind of where they're at. Now, against ranked teams 2 years ago, that was the fundamental difference. And I'll toss to you for some quick thoughts here. But 2 years ago, when they shocked everyone and did win the Big 12, they were 5-1 against ranked teams. Last year, that wasn't the case. They struggled mightily. They were 0-5 against ranked teams. So they're going to have to swell up when it matters most and perform in those critical games if they want to get back in the hunt that they were 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think a lot of this depends on the play of Blake Shapen, and I don't want to sound cliche about it depends on the quarterback, but let's be honest, like 18 touchdowns to 10 picks, that's not going to be that's just not going to work for them to be able to win. But the good thing is, you're talking about scheduling for success, and we flashed the schedule up here at the beginning of this. They got Texas State, former Big 12 member Utah in week 2, and then they have Long Island, who West Virginia just beat like a drum not all that long ago. So you've got
just it, right?
Yeah, and you've got a very, very good opportunity. And all 3 of those games, by the way, are at home. So they do get the Utah Utes at home. If they get out to a 3-0 start, they welcome in Texas. I mean, that's an opportunity for them to get 4 wins right off the bat, one of which would be presumably a top 25, maybe top 20, 15 win in Texas. And who knows where Utah will land in that too. I'm sure that they're going to get some votes as well. So
yeah,
I think Blake Shapen is the key to their success offensively. Defensively, I'm not really all that concerned about them just because I know Dave Aranda is going to get it figured out.
Yeah. And you talked about that schedule, that non-league schedule with Utah coming to town. I mean, I have to think, especially that early in the season, Kyle Whittingham is the type of savvy defensive coach that he's going to recognize these early season holes. I mean, you lost guys like Jacob Gall, Connor Galvin, Grant Miller, 4 of 5 starters up front. That's not an ideal circumstance to be facing a Kyle Whittingham defense early on as you sort yourself out. So that'll be an interesting matchup. I have to think they're going to have to try and find a way with that outside zone, with that stretch play, with their bread and butter. Richard Reese really showed some flashes last year at running back. Dominic Rhodes, solid transfer that has a lot of promise for them from Oklahoma State. So the pieces are in place behind center. Like you said, if they can set the table for Blake Shapen and find some way to sort themselves out through the non-conference schedule and find what works up front with new starters, then I think Jeff Grimes will have something to work with. And I agree with you on the defensive side. Aranda will figure things out. Even though last year, that's the from a struggle standpoint on third down, and this is what he's going to work to address in the offseason. That's the worst third down defense Baylor has had. And this was under Dave Aranda's watch since 2012. And we remember the 70-63 Baylor defense in 2012, much like we remember the West Virginia defense in 2012. But so interesting things to keep an eye on.
Yeah, moving on to the second team here. It's the first of the newcomers. It's BYU and Kalani Sitake. So here's the BYU schedule. Here's we flash up on the screen. Sam Houston, Southern Utah, and Arkansas before they kick things off in Big 12 play on the road at Kansas. So this is a couple of opportunities here for BYU to kind of get things going before they really start to get tested. And Jed, for Mountaineer fans, they're going to know who's at quarterback.
Yeah, they are.
BYU team, and that's the old former replacement for Kenny Pickett at Pitt, and that is Keaton Slovis. Yes, he is transferred to BYU, so West Virginia will see him for a second straight year at a second school. And again, I'd hate to beat the drum here, but it sounds like just looking out from what they have returning production-wise, that he's, again, going to be the key to their success. Is he not?
And something tells me Mountaineer fans are going to be very familiar with the pep rally at Pitt. and the F-bomb that Mr. Slovis dropped. But I
and
mean,
and they will be coming to Morgantown.
they
So
will be coming to Morgantown. Yes. So, on the one hand, you have a very well established kid who has almost 10,000 career yards passing. On the other hand, you have a kid who, over the course of his career, has thrown 33 picks. So, he was 10 touchdowns, 9 picks, even at Pitt last year. So, he will put the football in harm's way. That's going to be one of the questions. But first of all, when you talk about these four new teams, on some level, each of them have to undergo a transition, somewhat like we underwent from the Big East to the Big 12 back in 2012. And we remember the growing pains that we suffered from a lack of depth in stepping into such a league. So you ask yourself, which of these teams is most and least inclined to experience similar growing pains? I've always kind of viewed BYU as not necessarily a G5 team, not necessarily a P5 team, but maybe a quasi P5 team because of their schedule, because of their history. But when you look at the transition, first of all, Kalani Sitake already took part in one of these transitions. He was on the staff that took Utah from the Mountain West into the Pac-12. So he's undergone this before. And more interestingly, when you look at their record against P5 teams in recent years, first of all, they're 15-16 since he took over. Everybody remembers early in his tenure at FedEx Field, West Virginia won that exciting thriller down to the wire with the defensive stop and the turnover, the 35-32 game. That was only Sitake's third game, very early in his tenure. But they're 15-16 against P5 teams since he took over. But more importantly, 8-4 over the course of the last couple years. But again, that winning tradition, the last 16 years, 15 of those seasons, they posted winning records. I do think on some level, this is going to be about Keaton Slovis. I think he's going to need some help. They have some talented receivers on the perimeter returning. I think they're pretty creative with what they do on the offensive side of the football with Aaron Roderick, but the question marks arise on the defensive side of the football. I mean, you're talking about a team that had they were among the national leaders in returning production going into last year on the defensive side of the ball. Now, normally that translates to success. Well, it certainly didn't last year. I mean, their defense fell apart at the seams, and Kalani Sitake himself had to get very involved and hands-on, fire a guy that he'd been around and been on staff with for a long time. So they got to rebuild with a new D coordinator in Jay Hill. So I think the two questions or the two things to keep an eye on: how does that transition with the rebuild defensively go? And let's keep an eye on Keaton Slovis out of the gates and see if he can find a way from a scheduling standpoint. That's the thing you got to look at. New quarterback, new defense. So they open with Sam Houston. That has to help.
yeah.
Hit a couple of these early games there, right? I mean, talk about that, Schuyler.
Yeah, I mean, again, when you lose guys like a Puka Nakua or a Chris Brooks, that's big shoes to fill for this team for an offense that really wasn't explosive. But I mean, those two guys are that I mean, that was their leading rusher, their leading receiver
Absolutely. Yeah.
from a year ago. So to be able to have those two kind of, I don't want to call them preseason games, but I mean, let's face it, it's what they are.
Yeah.
Um,
Southern Utah, Sam Houston. Now they got a test when they
yeah,
go to Fayetteville, when they go to Arkansas by week 3. We're going to learn a lot about them because that's an up and coming Arkansas team with a lot of talent back. But so by the time they get into league play, we're going to know a lot about them. It's fascinating. I do think if they can overcome those shortcomings they suffered through defensively last year, and if you can get some element of production from Keaton Slovis, this is the type of roster that has an opportunity to work its way into what's expected to be that massive log jam kind of in the center of the Big 12, right? So I think this is a team that might be in position to do that. But I'm a Sitake guy. I think he's done a nice job there with some of the challenges that he's had to overcome. First of all, what's one thing Mountaineer fans might not know about BYU? What's one thing maybe they assume incorrectly? Well, when you talk to BYU people, one of the things they'll say, look, yeah, we got some older kids, but they're not up and down our roster. That's the exception, not the rule. We're not a bunch of 28 and 29-year-olds coming out there against your 20-year-olds. Yes, some of those, but by and large, that's the exception, not the rule. They're big physical kids. They hit Samoa hard from a recruiting standpoint. So they're going to bring a physical element and a physical style of football on both sides of the ball once they get things right defensively.
Yeah, when BYU is at its best, they are very strong in the trenches, and we've seen it over the years, especially defensively. I mean, you talk about Kyle Van Noy, Ezekiel Ansah. I mean, they've had some legitimate NFL talent in that front
Yes.
7 years past, and I feel like that is why they are probably going to have the most success in the Big 12 of these first four of newcomers because they can recruit to that, they can build that. And I think from a depth perspective, they can probably handle the schedule probably a little bit better than some of these other schools that we're going to get talking about here.
Their schedule, you're right, has been more akin to what they're about to undergo. Now it's more P5s than what they're used to. Okay. It certainly is that. But that's something to consider right there. But when you look at their style of play, when they come to Morgantown late in the season, they're built to play late season football. There's no doubt about that. But also from a scheduling standpoint, last thing I'll toss out there, remember West Virginia's first loss in our first year in the Big 12, our first conference loss? We went on the road to Texas, played them Saturday night, had a shootout, won a 48-45 game. We were 6th, they were 11th. We came back home, and next thing you know, we turn around, and in consecutive weeks, we're going to Texas again, but this time to Lubbock, and we absolutely got ambushed. Well, don't look now, but here comes BYU from Provo. The week before they come to Morgantown, they go to Austin to DKR, just like we did. They got to go back to Provo, just like we did. And then they got to make a long trip across the country, just like we did. So I see a parallel there. Maybe we can catch them at the right time late in the season after that trip at DKR. We'll see.
That's a very good point with these newcomers, especially the Pac-12 schools when they come in. When you look at where they are at on West Virginia's schedule, you got to kind of see where they're bouncing back and forth from, because that could be definitely a huge effect for sure. Before we get into our third team here, a quick word from Toothman Ford. We all know, let's be honest.
And plenty to pick from. Plenty to pick from. Yeah.
Plenty to pick from. They're the best people to work with. So if you're going to go get a car, go visit our friends at Toothman Ford, where cars cost less. All right, so our third team here on the Big 12 preview is the Cincinnati Bearcats, another one of the newcomers here in the Big 12. They go Eastern Kentucky, Pitt, and Miami, Ohio to open up their season before jumping into Big 12 play, where they will host Oklahoma. How about that for your first Big 12 game there in Cincinnati? I'm sure the Nippert Stadium will be rocking and packed for that one. So, Jed, let's just be honest here with Cincinnati. This is going to be a multi-year rebuild. This is not going to be a quick fix. I mean, you could look at the transfer portal and say maybe they can make this happen a little bit quicker, but just looking at what they have returning from last year, it's not very much. I mean, they completely flipped their whole offense. They got transfers all over the place at key positions. And I don't know what they're going to look like by the end of the season from a depth standpoint, because if they suffer some injuries, this could end up being a snowball effect where they end up maybe 4-8 or 5-7, maybe even worse. And in my opinion, this is probably one of the teams that I would have put below West Virginia in the Big 12 preseason rankings. I don't know how media saw this roster and said it's better than WVU, but that's just me.
Well, Scott Satterfield is a good football coach. He's replacing a good football coach, which we'll hit on. But Scott Satterfield at Appy State did a great job. Actually, he and Neal squared off a number of times when Neal was at Troy. He did a good job at Louisville. What might you expect out of Scott Satterfield taking things over? This is the type of thing that, from a transition standpoint, Schuyler, Luke Fickell put that program on such solid footing with the job that he did. It would have been really fun to watch the Cincinnati teams from a couple years ago with a stud at quarterback and an NFL first-round pick, one of the better corners, it turns out, in the NFL. Really a lot of talent splashed across both sides of that lineup a couple years ago. They were in the playoffs not that long ago. It would have been fun watching that Cincinnati against a Power 5 schedule to see how it could hold up, right? But that's not what you're getting. It's the type of thing that Luke Fickell built it up. And ordinarily, the mark of a good coach traditionally was, okay, what kind of shape did you leave the program in compared to how you took it over? Well, he left it in a lot better shape, right? But the problem now in the modern era, the portal impacts things in such a way that it never used to, that there's an exodus. And it stands to reason that when you lose your head coach, especially a coach the caliber of Luke Fickell, you're going to lose a lot of kids through the portal. So from a portal activity standpoint, when you look at on3.com, they're one of the many outfits that rate how teams project or do from a production standpoint in the portal. They have an index that they look at. Cincinnati ranked at the bottom of the Big 12 from that power index standpoint in the portal. Again, kind of to be expected when you're in a coaching transition, losing the likes of Luke Fickell. So, what can you expect with Scott Satterfield taking over? First of all, you can expect offensively, he's going to want to run the football. The last couple of years, his Louisville teams, nobody in the ACC had more rushing yards than his Louisville offenses the last couple of years. And maybe that will cater to the strength of the Cincinnati team if it has one. Dante Corleone's an NFL defensive tackle. He's a stud.
Yes.
And he's not alone on the Cincinnati defensive line. They have enough talent to be incredibly disruptive at the point of attack along that defensive line. They're solid at linebacker. They're not bereft of talent on the back end. So defensively, they might find a way. Now, the question is, can the style of play, again, new quarterback expected to be Emory Jones, athletic. He can move around, make things happen with his legs, but sometimes, again, might put the football in harm's way and turn it over. But if they run the football effectively enough, as Scott Satterfield did at Louisville, and he's going to want to and be hell-bent and intent on doing at Cincinnati to help that defense out, maybe take the air out of things, shrink the game a little bit, it would be interesting to see where this goes, because they also have a couple weapons from a special team standpoint. But that's kind of the way I see things, big picture, from a Cincinnati standpoint. Being back in the league once again with West Virginia, and you and I talked off camera, Schuyler, Cincinnati has played football longer than West Virginia. You can't say that about a lot of teams in this league, right? They've been at this a long time. Now, up until 2005, when you compare what they accomplished or didn't accomplish from way back when they started football in the Wyatt Earp days, I guess, right, up to 2005, it doesn't really compare to what they accomplished since. Once they joined the realigned Big East from 2005 into the American, what they've accomplished 17 years since, 14 bowl games, it's pretty impressive. They fashioned their entire brand and made a name for themselves. So I agree with you. I expect them to develop into a force to be reckoned with, but we're really catching them downturn with a new staff, with an exodus of talent. We'll see how it goes. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think they could be, and I hate to use the term sleeping giant because I think you could say that about maybe even each or three of the four newcomers in the Big 12. But I mean, you got a recruiting hotbed in the state of Ohio. And I know that for years they weren't able to really compete against Ohio State in recruiting. Now that you have that Big 12 logo next to you, I think that is going to help win some of those battles. So if they can keep some of that talent in state, that's going to go a long ways for Cincinnati. So, moving on to our
to your point, real quickly, let's
yeah,
close with this, Schuyler. Schuyler,
yeah,
to your point, real quickly, I'll bolster that recruiting point. Kentucky has made a heck of a living, Coach Stoops, by taking kids that Ohio State didn't want.
yeah.
What's to say Cincinnati can't step to the table and fill a similar in-state as opposed to across the river? Sorry to interrupt, but you made me think of that. A great point on the recruiting front by you. Yep.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, Ohio State is going to get to pick their class. That's just
Mm-hmm.
that's how it is. So
Yep.
Cincinnati's got a chance to get some of the leftovers, and oftentimes are pretty good leftovers to have at. So
Yep.
number 4, and it is somebody again West Virginia fans are familiar with, and that is Dana Holgorsen and Houston. They open up against UTSA, then they have Rice, and then they get into the conference play for a small little bit there with TCU before finishing out non-con play against Sam Houston and Jed. Similar situation to probably more so Cincinnati than BYU. That they're going to have to establish depth, and it's going to take a little while to do so. But looking at what they have coming back, it's not a lot. I mean, you're looking at both sides of the ball, and I mean, they're returning 4 starters. It's a defense. They gave up over 32 points a game last year. And Doug Belk, who was a part of Dana's staff here at West Virginia, he's going to have his work cut out for him. I mean, this is a massive, massive task that he has ahead of him. And I don't know that they're going to have the top tier talent right now. But I mean, again, Dana knows how to figure this stuff out offensively. It's just a matter of, is it going to be a similar transition for Dana, do you think, where he came in with West Virginia to the Big 12 and it was, oh, they just got to outscore everybody? Is that kind of the similar situation you see here with Houston?
To an extent. And if you remember, that worked until it didn't. We had to rebuild once again in 2013. but even down the stretch in 2012. But Doug's a good football coach. Doug Belk's a good football coach. And when you look at the job that he did 2 years ago, with what they called Houston's third ward defense. I mean, I love that nickname, but they led the FBS in third down percentage. Dana was actually calling things offensively in conjunction with Shannon Dawson, who's gone. We'll get to that. 2 years ago to help his defense out, to really keep them off the field and help minimize their snaps to some extent. So that worked to great effect 2 years ago when they had all this success. But a year ago, you saw them already, even before losing the talent that they've since lost, they plummeted from leading the nation in third down defense to nationally, they ranked 110 in that critical category last year. So the question is, can Doug Belk find a way to overcome that? Last year, he tried to do so by bringing pressure and outnumbering you offensively. It didn't work so well. They were victimized by a ton of big plays, but they did pressure the quarterback. But the deal with that is when you so consistently bring numbers, somebody's band's going to be playing. And very often it's going to be the band of the other offense. And that's what you saw play out with Houston last year. So the question is, can they overcome some of those issues, some of those talent shortcomings? I mean, not a ton of stuff to work with. You'd start with Nelson Caesar on the defensive line. He's a guy with some potential. AJ Halsey on the back end, a guy at safety that can do some different things for them. But that's the question. So I would jump over to the offensive side, and I agree with you. If anybody can figure things out after losing a 4,000-yard passer, as they did in Clayton Tune, after losing Tank Dell, who declared early for the draft, after catching 109 passes, I mean, Dana finds a way, whether it's Mario Alford, whether it's Kevin White, he recycles on the perimeter and finds a way in his version of the air raid to really feed the football to the appropriate people and put them in space and give them an opportunity to make some things happen. Now, they have a veteran presence up front at the point of attack, so there's some potential there. Can they establish that enough? Okay, they lost Alton McCaskill at the end of the spring, was a true difference-making running back. They lost him in the portal. He's off to Colorado with Dion. So they got Tony Mathis. Look, I'm not knocking Tony. Tony is serviceable. He's a steady starter. He's reliable. I expect him to do some solid things for Dana. I'm just not sure he's Alton McCaskill. So I mean, we'll see how the run game works out. I think he'll find something to work in the pass game. I just have to believe if Donovan Smith works out, and Donovan Smith did show some things at Texas Tech. I mean, we saw that firsthand, with West Virginia. He's a talented kid. He's played a lot of football, so you're not starting from scratch with Donovan Smith. So I have to believe that Dana, with his pedigree and with his creativity, he's going to find a way to turn either Sam Brown, a former Mountaineer receiver, or Joseph Manjack. He has Mike O'Laughlin at tight end. He's going to find a way to put those guys in position to succeed and have some opportunities from the offensive side, enough to make things interesting. But I do think there are parallels. We talked about Cincinnati and what they lost. Well, once again, don't you think Dana would love to be coming into the Big 12 with Clayton Tune pulling the trigger and with Tank Dell, playing pitch and catch? But that's not the case. So over the course of time, Houston's the type of market that with a Big 12 brand on your jersey, you can recruit to. Let's just see how things work from a transition standpoint. The thing is, I don't know if Dana will be ambushed to the extent that he was the first time around, because at least this time he's been through it, so he knows to expect it. He recognizes that what a lack of depth can do. It's just how quickly can he address that. Another program that I think has a bright future in the Big 12, much like we talked about with Cincinnati. So we'll see how things go right out of the gate. We draw them on a Thursday night. So I would imagine we're going to take their best shot, all things considered. But I think they have a bright future. It's just how quickly can they come out of the gates and play that out. Dana's been trying to warn them for the better part of 18 months. And they've been recruiting really with a Big 12 angle and perspective and narrative for the last year and a half. Dana's talked about that. Yeah. So it's not like they're starting from scratch with that front either. You don't have to officially be in the league before you start telling kids you're in the league. So they've done a good job of that. We'll just see how things go early on and see what kind of growing pains they might expect.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a great point, because when he was at West Virginia, he didn't really have that window to say, like, hey, we're going to be in the Big 12 conference. It was kind of a very quick process. But Yeah, Dana's going to obviously figure some things out offensively. I think they've got some guys that can make some plays. Donovan Smith, as you mentioned, has dual threat ability, and it's just a matter of consistency. I really think with him, it's kind of Jekyll and Hyde at times. And if you can kind of take some of the bad out of his game and the forced throws and to try to be a hero and all that stuff, if you take that away from him a little bit, but allow him to still play within himself, then I think this offense can really open up for Houston. So, going to Iowa State, Matt Campbell looking to bounce back and get things back on track, but he's dealing with a whole heck of a lot right now, isn't he, Jed?
Oh, he sure is. Stay tuned on a daily basis. Talk about,
Serious.
realignment news. Well, there could be camp news coming out of Iowa State. You had this off the field. It was Iowa State and Iowa to some extent. Strange things going on from a gambling perspective. Some kids maybe did a couple of the wrong things. Quarterback Hunter Deckers did so and even got caught on tape on video doing so. That went viral. So very unfortunate for him. But he was a productive player for him last year. Now he finds himself in a bad spot. I mean, again, day to day, we're kind of keeping our eye on news to come out of that camp to see what plays out there. Rocco Becht, Mountaineer fans need to
Yeah.
remember, Anthony Becht's son, Rocco, pretty daggone quarterback in his own right. He would be the number two. He'd be the viable option to be pulling that trigger for their offense. And when you talk about their offense, they're going a different direction. They weren't happy with how things unfolded last year with Tom Manning. They couldn't run the football. Now, part of that I have to blame on the fact that early in the year they were really high on Cartavius Norton, and Cartavius Norton suffered an injury that cost him most of the season, didn't play. So that hurt them. They were disjointed up front along the offensive line. They just couldn't find any continuity. And Tom Manning, who so often, I mean, he even left for a year to go coach the tight ends with the Colts, and they brought him back. He was so creative with that tight end room. We've seen what he did with some of those big bodied, giant frame tight ends through the years. Well, that wasn't part of what they did last year. They lost some of those guys. They struggled to find guys to fill those roles. Xavier Hutchinson was kind of really the only thing they had. Sometimes people would bracket their coverage to him, he'd still make plays. But Nate Shieldhouse is going to be directing their offense now from an OC standpoint. We'll see which direction that goes. And then on the defensive side, you can expect, John Heacock's defense is going to show up. They're going to play out. Again, last year, just about every key metric you look at, scoring defense, number one in the Big 12, total defense, number one in the Big 12, pass defense, rush defense. Curiously enough, the only area that John Heacock's defense struggled last year was when the field shrunk and they found themselves in the red zone. The Cyclones had the worst touchdown rate allowed. 69% of the time, the opposition reached the end zone once they got inside the 20 in the red zone against Iowa State. But outside of that, defensively, they were exceptional. But curious to me, the things that Matt Campbell, when he came from the MAC and showed up at Iowa State to replace Paul Rhodes, how he turned that around was playing sound fundamental football and being sound in the kick game, right? So they didn't penalize themselves. They didn't back up. They moved forward. From a special team standpoint, they only helped themselves. They didn't hurt themselves. And I'm looking out there last year, Schuyler, they couldn't find a long snapper for their punt team, which led them to having 3 punts blocked. And I'll be honest with you, after being out there in Ames last year and watching that game, they're lucky it was only 3. I couldn't believe that. I mean, I'm watching that kid in pregame, and I'm like, this is the best you can find? And I'm like, wow. So they were lucky to escape with only 3, but those are the types of things that the Matt Campbell teams that had success in the past. Now, let's not lose sight of the fact that they lost in 1 year 2 generational players. They lost Brees Hall and they lost Brock Purdy. So they lost Pat White and Steve Slayton in the same year. They had to find a way to overcome that. That's not easy to do. So there are some question marks surrounding that program. But the biggest question mark would be from a culture standpoint. They hang their hat on culture, and you have all these off the field issues unfolding. So there's some uncertainty there. I have to believe long term, Matt Campbell figures this out. But that's another one that, look, the schedule is going to matter. Who they play and who they don't play is going to matter. Those are the types of things they're going to have to do, because they found a way, only because of that incredibly stingy defense, to hang around in so many of these games last year. But because of their lack of a running game, because of their inability to push the football downfield with any level of consistency, they just couldn't score enough to make a difference in these tight games. And they lost just about all of them. I mean, even West Virginia, who struggled against the run a year ago, shut this offense down for 3 quarters defensively against the Iowa State run game. And finally, because the West Virginia offense just couldn't stay on the field and string anything together, the defense was out there so much the dam finally had to break. In the fourth quarter it did. But Iowa State had massive deficiencies in the run game, part of it due to injury, part of it due to issues along the offensive front. But you got a new offensive coordinator, potentially a new quarterback, stay tuned, and no Xavier Hutchinson. So who might be the answer on the perimeter? We'll see. They got some guys who could be candidates, but let's see how this unfolds.
Yeah, I mean that's 100% right there. You're spot on with the run game. I mean, 3.3 yards a carry. I mean, that's just not going to do it. You know, I mean, that for a Matt Campbell coach team, that's their bread and butter. They run the ball, they play defense, they shrink the game. Jarrell Brock, he had 445 yards. He was their leading rusher a year ago, 4.5 yards a pop, which isn't too bad, but they've got to figure out something with this running game. And if they do, and really they're almost going to have to even more now if you have Rocco Beckton, a quarterback who has virtually no experience. So if you're putting him out there and he's having to carry the load offensively, throwing the ball around, you're going to be in big trouble. So,
and we're just assuming, Schuyler, we're assuming that because John Heacock is there, defensively, they'll find a way to overcome the loss of a first-round pick as an edge rusher and Will McDonald. They'll find a way to overcome the loss of more linebackers like Orion Vance, Kobe Reeder, Anthony Johnson was an instrumental kid for them on the back end. We're just assuming that they'll find a way defensively because of Haycock's presence to overcome that before you get into the issues offensively. So we'll see.
Yeah, quick thank you to GoMart, here to keep you going. Make sure you're signing up for your GoMart rewards. And now we got the Kansas Jayhawks, who opened up last season just absolutely red hot. They went out 5-0 to start the season. College game days coming to town. Everyone in the country really was talking about this massive turnaround that Lance Leipold directed, and rightfully so. I mean, he has definitely earned the respect of me and probably you and a lot of others around the college football game for how quickly he's turned this program around. He's got the preseason player of the year on offense, this quarterback Jalen Daniels, a lot of which that was part of why they kind of fell apart there in the second half of the season. They went 1-6 down the stretch. He was out with an injury, but this is a very intriguing team. It's weird to say, Jed, watch out for the Kansas Jayhawks. I mean, could they actually be a team that really pushes for a top, 3 or 4 spot? I mean, I don't know if we go that high with them, but they've got some playmakers now with Jalen Daniels and Devin Neal.
They're explosive, but they've got to solve a lot of things defensively. Kansas a year ago, on the defensive side of the football, had the worst scoring defense in the Big 12. They had the worst total defense in the Big 12, the worst rush defense in the Big 12. They couldn't get teams off the field defensively on third down. So they couldn't play dead in the Western on the defensive side of the ball. And they lost, oh, by the way, their third down pass rush specialist, Lonnie Phelps. So he was kind of a difference maker who transferred in and gave him a lot of production for one season. But here's what's curious about this. You mentioned Jalen Daniels and what a terrific job he did for them. And he was a big part of the reason they had so many weapons offensively, but he was the straw that stirred the drink. And he was a big part of the reason that this was one of the critical keys. First of all, the staff's been together for a long time. When you look at this Lance Leipold staff, whether it's Andy Kotelnicki coordinating the offense, Brian Borland on the defensive side, that's why I do think they'll figure things out defensively. It worked at Buffalo. It worked at the D3 level. He understands and trusts his staff. They have a plan. It's just going to take some time to plug in the appropriate personnel, in this case on the defensive side. But when you look at Jalen Daniels, one of the things that they were so good at, in fact, better than anybody in the Big 12, they led the Big 12 in third down offense. They converted 50.6% of their time. That is absolutely exceptional. Okay, now that was after being dead last in 2020, 2021. You want to turn your fortunes around offensively. Do that. Go from dead last to elite in third down conversions. That's a quick way to do it. And here's what's impressive. I talked about coaching. I talked about that staff. I talked about Andy Kotelnicki, their offensive coordinator. Even after the Jalen Daniels injury, even with a backup running the show, they converted 47% of their third downs. They were still elite. So that tells you they got a little something going on. Now, what's interesting is when you break down the numbers, one of the things I track is I look at pass run tendencies for each team. I look at the snaps per game offensively, the snaps per game their defense was asked to defend. Because in large part of that success on third down, you'd think, well, that puts you in position offensively to give your defense a hand and keep them off the field, right? Well, the truth is, Kansas ran the fewest snaps per game out of any of the 14 teams that will constitute this year's Big 12. They only ran 63 snaps a game, which left their defense out there 76 snaps a game, tied for second most faced by a defense in the Big 12. That's what the recipe for a defensive struggle is. I mean, asking your defense to defend 76 snaps a game. Well, how do those two things live in the same world? An elite third down offense, but a defense tasked with defending 76 snaps a game. I'll tell you how. Big plays on the offensive side. When you look at the big plays this offense have made, not just in the pass game, but with Devin Neal in the run game and others, they, from a 50-plus yard play standpoint, from a splash play standpoint, even if you look at the 40-plus yard plays, only TCU had more in the Big 12, and TCU, of course, advanced to the CFP championship, played 15 games. So Kansas, on a very regular basis, was making game-breaking plays, and they were only on the field for a handful of snaps at a time. Now, they were buying themselves more opportunities with that success on third down, but they didn't have a lot of them. It was kind of a bang, bang score, bang, bang, big play type of offense. Now, the question is, can they address the shortcomings that they had on the defensive side of the football? Because on the offensive side, we talk about how good they were, but not only were they good, that almost fully intact. I mean, to their to Devin Neal to the offensive line, they really only lose one key guy up front. Some of those guys transfer in from Buffalo a year ago, and that helped from a continuity standpoint with what Kotelnicki and what Lance Leipold wanted to do. They understood their scheme. Now, on the defensive side of the football, that's going to be the question. Can you have guys? It's going to have to start with Kenny Logan. He is an elite defender on the back end for them defensively. He's one of the better defensive backs in the Big 12. It's going to have to be built around him. They have some transfers coming in. Kobe Bryant's a good football player at corner. So they have some pieces in place. Depth could be an issue for them on the defensive side. Before you can develop depth, you must first develop talent. So they're kind of still in that phase of things. Let's see how things go. Again, I have to believe that over the arc of time, Brian Borland will figure things out on the defensive side, much like Kotelnicki and the offensive staff have. But let's see how that goes. One of the things that they did offensively that helped themselves out, they understood the need to get the football out quickly. And they didn't ask the offensive line to hold up against some of these Big 12 pass rushes. And it worked with great success, not just last year, but even 2 years ago. So let's see if similar things can play out on the defensive side. Can they get creative? Can they steal a few turnovers? Can they steal a few possessions? We'll see. But that's what has to happen. For Kansas to truly be taken seriously and take the next step, have to address those things on the defensive side.
Yeah, I would have been really interested to see what Kansas would have done down the stretch had Jalen Daniels been healthy. I think that would have been really interesting to see. Could they have gotten to maybe 7, 8 wins, maybe even 9? I mean, how crazy would that be? I mean, to see Kansas with 9 wins in one football season. I mean, it's unthinkable. But I think that's the key for Kansas is how does Jalen Daniels respond to all the adjustments that everyone in the Big 12 is going to make? Because now teams know about Jalen Daniels. He's not this best kept secret anymore. It's all out there. So how do they defend him? How do they take Devin Neal out of the game? You know, Highshaw is a kid that, as I mentioned off air, scored 2 touchdowns against West Virginia. He was the guy that really kind of did damage against West Virginia.
Minnesota.
So that's a tough situation there. But if they can overcome that and find some other guys to help complement Daniels and Neal, I think Kansas is going to make this another successful season and prove that 2022 was not just an anomaly. And for the final team of our 2-part preview here of the Big 12, we're going to go to Kansas State. And I'm just going to throw it out there, Jed. This is my Big 12 preseason pick to win the league. I love Kansas State. Maybe I'm just giving another shot at it. I had them as my preseason pick last year. Fell a little short of that, but I love this Kansas State team. I think Will Howard is a terrific quarterback, and really, I think that's what kind of hindered them a little bit a year ago, is they were trying to force this two quarterback system thing with Adrian Martinez, and by the time they figured out, hey, Will Howard's the guy, it was probably a little bit too late. So I like Will Howard. He's going to have a huge year for them. They've got some playmakers offensively, and you'll hit on those guys here in just a moment. But they open up the season southeastern Missouri, I believe that is, yeah. And then they go play Troy and then Missouri before they open up with UCF in Big 12 play. So am I crazy for thinking K-State Big 12 preseason pick here, Jed, or am I okay?
Well, no, they were the absolute real deal legit throughout the course of last year. It wasn't just a team that got hot at the right time down the stretch. I mean, they played good football throughout. We now see what that loss to Tulane, which seemed catastrophic early in the year, what it turned out to really be. Tulane was a pretty good football team, right? But this is a team that blew out Missouri. They blew out Oklahoma State. They blew out Baylor, who 2 years ago, as we talked about, won the Big 12. They blew out Kansas. So this was a solid football team throughout the course of the 2022 season before knocking off TCU in Jerry World to win the Big 12. So now the question becomes, okay, obviously they can recruit talent, they can develop talent, but can they replace talent? Because let's start on the offensive side of the football. That's one of the things they're going to have to do. Malik Knowles was a difference maker on the perimeter. He was a big play receiver. He was a stud. We know what Deuce Vaughn was. I mean, nobody's going to refute what Deuce Vaughn was. Now, I do like what they have returning up front on the offensive line. As a matter of fact, if there's a team that's as loaded as West Virginia, or maybe even a touch more so, we'll see. Up front along the offensive line, it might be the Kansas State Wildcats. So you talked about Will Howard. I like Will Howard too. I think that one of the ways that a quarterback proves his mettle as a field general is, what do you do on 3rd and long when the defense is not just third and manageable, but 3rd and long, when the defenses can give you their absolute most exotic looks? Do you have an answer for that? Do you stand tall in the face of pressure? Do you know your quick release and quick answer throws? Do you have a mastery of your offense? How do you do? Well, here's how Will Howard did in third down and 10 plus yards to go, which is 3rd and long, with the way they equate it from a metric standpoint. His passer rating was 271.6. Now I'm going to give you some perspective on that. The last time an FBS quarterback had a passer rating higher than that was 2019 with Tua at Alabama. So Will Howard answered the bell. We saw a couple of those in Morgantown on 3rd and long, right? So Will Howard absolutely answered the bell in those critical transition situations for K-State. But now can they figure out how to replace those weapons that they lost? They got some possibilities and some candidates. Trayshawn Ward coming in from Florida State, expected to be the starter. I don't know if I'd necessarily call him the feature back, because you also have DJ Giddens. So you have a couple weapons there. Phillip Brooks, I should say, seems like he's been at K-State forever. So he's an option on the perimeter. A guy that I really thought was underrated for the better part of last year was Ben Sinnott at tight end. He's a playmaker for them. You talk about a guy who delivers in critical times. Now, we'll see how this switch to the defensive side of the football that they underwent 2 years ago. It's been very effective for them. When they moved from an even front to an odd stack, I mean, traditionally, during the Bill Snyder tenure, they were an even front defense that would kind of just outlast you and wait on you to blink offensively. They tried to force you into those types of mistakes. Now, they moved to a more exotic under Joe Klanderman running that defense, a more exotic odd stack defense, so they can get creative. Now, it's easier to get creative when you have weapons like Anyudike, but Anyudike's now hopping his squares with the Kansas City Chiefs. So Julian Brents, an NFL corner, is now off to the next level. Can you replace those types of players on the defensive side of the football and continue to get exotic? Because what they did, even with all that NFL talent, they had a couple NFL defensive backs and an NFL pass rusher, and they still gave up 9 plays of 50 plus yards through the air. So they gave up some big plays. Now, part of that's tied to the fact they like to roll the dice and take some chances with a few exotic looks. But so the question is, can this program, which already established itself, they can recruit, they can attract talent, and they can develop, but now can they develop to the point of replacing talent? Because they're going to be asked to do so at very critical spots on both sides of the football. So stay tuned.
Yeah, and I love Kansas State. Like I said, I think they're a team that's really going to push for a Big 12 spot or a spot in the Big 12 title game, and maybe even more. I don't know if I want to go as far as saying they're a college football playoff team, but maybe no. But yeah, that's going to do it for the first part of our two-part series here, the Big 12 preview. One final thank you to Fortis for your performance and financial security guaranteed. Make sure to visit fortis.us.com. For Jed Drenning, I'm Schuyler Callihan, and as always, be sure to tell an ear about your favorite WU football podcast, In the Gun.